The candles in Hartwell Hall had been burning for 3 hours before the first carriage rolled through the iron gates, and by the time the last guest arrived, the ballroom blazed so completely that the windows fogged with heat despite the December frost pressing in from every side. 800 candles, the housekeeper had counted them. 300 guests, each announced at the top of the stair by a footman in white gloves and a voice trained to carry. The flowers alone, white hothouse roses banked against every pillar, threaded through the gallery rail, massed in urns so heavy they required 2 men each to position them, had cost more than most men earned in a year. The music was already playing, something light and forgettable from the hired quartet, and the Viscount Ashmore's daughter had arrived in a gown the precise color of fresh cream, cut in the new fashion, and every eye in the room had found her the moment she crossed the threshold and had not entirely released her since. This was, by every external measure, the precise sort of evening for which Hartwell Hall had been designed. A spectacle, a display, a machinery of wealth and title and eligible intention moving in perfect glittering formation. And at the edge of all that brilliant, humming machinery, seated at a writing desk tucked behind the east pillar where no one had thought to put a candelabra, checking the evening's accounts against the florist's invoice with a pencil she had sharpened herself, was Miss Cecily Marsh. She wore gray wool. It was the second time she had worn it to Hartwell Hall, and she had noticed it herself, though she doubted anyone else had. The dress was clean and pressed and entirely appropriate for a woman engaged to manage the household records, which is what she was, though the word engaged implied a formality that had never been offered. She had simply begun. 4 months ago she had arrived at the hall in answer to a notice placed by the estate's solicitor, had asked 3 questions about the accounts that no one before her had thought to ask, and had been shown to a desk in the east corridor and left there, and she had not stopped working since. The pencil moved down the invoice column. 800 candles at 6 shillings the dozen. She had negotiated the rate herself 6 weeks ago, cutting the original quotation by a third by pointing out in a letter to the chandler that the hall had purchased from his establishment for 11 years and had never once contested a bill. The chandler had come down without argument. The savings sat in the accounts in her own handwriting, a small column of recovered margin that no one had noticed and no one had thanked her for, and she had returned to the next invoice. She was doing this, measuring the florist's bill against the delivery record, when the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened and the room altered. It did not erupt. It was not the Viscount's daughter this time, who had drawn noise and open admiration. This was a different response, the sort that moves through a crowd like a change in air pressure before weather comes in, a quieting, a turning, a collective repositioning of bodies. Cecily looked up from the desk. He stood at the top of the stair, and his footman had already finished saying his title, though the syllables were still settling. The Duke of Aldermere. He was tall, and he wore black. Not the fashionable black of the young men who thought it artistic, but the plain, unornamented black of a man who had chosen it once and saw no reason to revisit the choice. No decorations on his coat, no signet ring that she could see from this distance. He looked at the ballroom with the expression of a man completing a necessary obligation, and he moved down the stair at the pace of someone who had decided how quickly he would descend, and had no intention of adjusting it for the crowd. Cecily watched him for a moment with a particular stillness of someone cataloging information before its use is clear. Then she returned to the florist's invoice. The Duke's name appeared twice in the account she managed, once as the primary creditor of a loan made to the late Lord Hartwell 7 years prior, and once in a note she had found in the solicitor's file, written in the estate's original steward's hand, to the effect that His Grace had agreed to defer collection of the outstanding sum provided the hall remained in good management. She did not know what good management meant to him. She had been working for 4 months on the reasonable assumption that it meant what it ought to mean, which was that the accounts were accurate, the creditors paid on schedule, and the household run without waste. She made a small correction to the invoice total, noted it, and turned the page. The Duke had not looked in her direction. There was no reason he would. The desk behind the east pillar was not a feature of the ballroom. It was a necessity of the working house that had been pushed out of sight. The woman at it was not a guest. She was part of the architecture of the evening, no more remarkable than the additional footman stationed at the card-room door or the kitchen maid, who had spent the day polishing glasses she would never drink from. But as the evening wore on, and as the quartet played and the guests circulated and the Viscount's daughter, Lady Sophronia Vane, Cecily had seen the name in the guest list move through the room with the composed, measuring ease of a woman who understood precisely what she was there to be considered for. Cecily became aware that the Duke of Aldermere had positioned himself in such a way that the east pillar was not entirely outside his sight line. She did not give this more weight than the evidence warranted. A man of his position standing near a structural pillar at a crowded party was a man who had found a convenient wall to put his back to. She finished the florist's column, started on the wine merchants, and did not look up again for 40 minutes. When she did, it was because she had found a discrepancy in the wine merchant's figures. 11 bottles of claret listed at delivery that did not appear in the seller's receiving log, and she had raised her head to make a note on her separate query sheet. The Duke was 12 feet away. He was not looking at the room. He was looking at the desk. He was looking with the precise, unreadable attention of someone who has identified a thing they do not yet understand at her. Cecily held his gaze for the 3 seconds that propriety permitted, long enough to establish that she had seen him and had not flinched, and then she looked back at the wine merchant's invoice. The query note was already written. There were 11 bottles to account for, and she intended to account for them. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. Cecily Marsh had been 12 years old when her father died, and the household had needed someone to manage it, and she had been the only person in it who had thought to look at what managing it actually required. Her mother was a gentle woman and a bewildered one, skilled at needlework and at maintaining the small social courtesies that had been the currency of their modest Wiltshire life and entirely unequipped for creditors. Cecily's older brother George had already left for a commission that ate most of what his father had set aside for him and returned nothing. Her father's brother, Mr. Roland Marsh, had arrived 2 weeks after the funeral, wearing the expression of a man who had been patient for some time and felt that patience was now due its reward. He had sat across the dining table from Cecily's mother and explained, in the measured tones of a man who believed he was being kind, that the estate, a modest property, a farmhouse, 12 acres, and a wool-carding business that had been declining for 6 years, was now, in the absence of a male heir of sufficient age, in a complicated legal position, and that the simplest resolution would be for Roland himself to take on its management. Cecily had been seated at the end of the table that day. No one had asked her to leave, because no one had thought it necessary to ask. She was 12. She was a girl. She had sat in the chair and listened to Roland Marsh explain her family's situation with the quiet alertness of someone who understands that the shape of the next 10 years is being decided in this conversation, and that no one in the room knows it except her. What Roland Marsh had not mentioned, what he perhaps did not know, because he had not looked at the accounts, was that the wool-carding business, despite its decline, still had 3 active contracts with merchants in Bath, that 2 of those contracts contained renewal clauses that had not been triggered, and that the farmhouse carried a debt against it of £42 to a Salisbury lender that was not, as Roland implied, fixed and unavoidable. but had been written with a renegotiation term that came due in 8 months. Cecily had spent the evening of that meeting reading every document her father had kept in the locked drawer of his study, to which she had known the key's location since she was 9. She had not told Roland about the renegotiation term. She had written to the Salisbury lender herself in her mother's name 6 weeks before the term came due, and had secured a rate reduction of £11 annually in exchange for a letter of confirmation from the wool merchant in Bath, which she had also obtained herself, writing as her mother's secretary and signing only with initials. The debt was renegotiated before Roland had finished cataloging the furniture he intended to remove. The savings meant the farmhouse was not sold that year, or the next. Roland Marsh managed the estate in name. Cecily managed it, in fact. She kept the accounts in a bound notebook she had purchased herself from the stationer in Marlborough, using money she had set aside from the household budget over 6 weeks without anyone noticing. Every entry was dated. Every figure was sourced. She wrote in a small, clear hand that wasted no space because the notebooks were her own expense and she had learned not to waste what she paid for herself. For 7 years she worked this way. She negotiated with the wool merchants. She drafted the renewal clauses. She reduced the Salisbury debt to nothing in 4 years, 2 years ahead of Roland's stated expectation, by identifying a surplus in the quarterly hay sales that Roland had been attributing to weather variation without checking the actual harvest weights. She hired the farm manager who stopped the West Fields drainage problem, and she did it by placing an advertisement in the Marlborough newspaper and reviewing 6 applications herself, because Roland had announced he would handle it and had then left for Bath for the better part of 3 weeks. She made 6 decisions of consequence in those 7 years that kept the modest Marsh property from being absorbed into Roland's debts, and she was credited with none of them, because the machinery of her world had no mechanism for crediting a woman's name to what her hands had built. There had been one moment when she might have broken. She was 19 and a solicitor's clerk from Devizes. A young man named Partridge, who had seen her reviewing the farm manager's contract in the estate's front parlor, had told her, without cruelty, but with the confidence of a man repeating a self-evident truth, that the merchants were beginning to wonder whether a real man of business was overseeing the property, and that she might consider allowing Roland to be more visibly present in negotiations. She had looked at Partridge for a moment that was slightly longer than comfortable. Then she had said that the merchants' wondering had not prevented the renewal of all 3 Bath contracts and the retirement of the Salisbury debt, and that if their wondering produced concerns she was happy to address in writing. She was available every morning before 9 o'clock. Partridge had left, and she had picked up the farm manager's contract and continued reading. She had been 23 when the Wiltshire property had finally been settled. Her mother remarried, quietly, to a retired clergyman in Bath who was steady and kind and required nothing of Cecily, and Cecily had found herself in possession of £40, a reference letter from the Bath wool merchant that was more complimentary than she had expected, and no particular direction. She had seen the Hartwell Hall notice in the newspaper. She had answered it. She had asked her 3 questions about the account's current state, the creditor's schedule, and the estate's relationship with its remaining tenants. And she had been given the desk behind the east pillar, and she had not stopped since. There had been one person in all of it who had seen her clearly. Her father, in the last weeks of his illness, had called her to sit beside him, and had said, in a voice already thin from the disease taking him, "You are the sharpest mind in this house, Cecily. I am sorry the house is too small to let you use it properly." She had been 11. She had held the words for 14 years the way a person holds a compass when the road is dark. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She had decided that at 12 in the dining room while Roland Marsh explained her family's future, and she had not revised the decision since. The Duke of Aldermere's name in the Hartwell accounts had been troubling her for 6 weeks before she understood why. It was not the sum, though the sum, £11,000, was substantial, and it was not the terms of the deferral, which were reasonable. It was a smaller thing, a notation in the original loan document, made in the previous estate steward's hand, that the Duke had requested quarterly reports on the Hall's accounts, and that those reports had been sent to his London address until the steward's departure from the estate, at which point they had simply stopped. No one had resumed them. The new steward, a man named Hargreaves, who had lasted 5 months before the account state had driven him out, had apparently not known the reports existed. Cecily had resumed them. She had written to the Duke's solicitor in London, explained the gap, and enclosed a report covering the 4 months of her tenure. She had expected nothing, or perhaps a formal acknowledgment. What she received 3 weeks later was a letter from one Edward Forsyth, identified as the Duke's personal advisor, thanking her for the resumption of correspondence and asking, with what she recognized as careful precision, 3 questions about the estate's wool merchant agreements. They were the same 3 questions she had asked on her first day. She had answered them the same afternoon. 6 weeks of correspondence had followed, each exchange growing slightly more specific, slightly more substantive, the questions moving from the general shape of the estate's finances to the particular detail of the creditor schedule, the tenant renewal terms, and the condition of the north granary, which she had inspected herself in November and found to be in need of re-roofing before spring. She had enclosed her inspection notes, written in the same small, clear hand she used for everything. She did not know what the Duke himself knew of any of this. Advisors answered advisors. She was a woman managing accounts behind a pillar. She sent her reports and received questions and answered them, and she continued to work. The Duke of Aldermere had not intended to attend the Hartwell Hall evening. He had been in the country for 14 months, at his own estate at Aldermere Park in Northamptonshire, attending to matters that had required his attention since his mother's death the previous winter, and he had not been in London or in any large company for most of that time, and he had not particularly wished to resume. But Forsyth had put the invitation on his desk 3 days before the event with a note attached. The Hartwell account. It would be worth observing the management directly, Your Grace. He had read the 6 reports from the Hartwell estate correspondent, identified only as Miss C. Marsh in a hand so precise it had struck him the first time as the work of someone who had been taught to make every mark count. He had read the inspection notes for the North Granary. He had read the annotated renegotiation of the candle contract, which Forsyth had enclosed with a brief comment to the effect that the original rate had stood unchanged for 11 years before Miss Marsh's intervention, and that the saving represented, annualized, a not inconsiderable recovered margin. He had read the 3-page response to his advisor's questions, in which the wool merchant agreements were described with a precision that suggested their author had not only read the contracts but understood the leverage points within them. He was a man who had been managing a large estate since he was 22, when his father's health had made it necessary, and who had been managing it alone since his father's death 5 years ago, and who had learned in that time to recognize the difference between a person who understood accounts and a person who understood the living system behind the accounts. Most people who worked with figures understood the figures. They did not understand that the figures were records of decisions made by people, and that the quality of those decisions could be read in the margins between what was expected and what was actual. Miss Marsh understood both. He did not know how he knew this from 6 reports and a set of inspection notes. He knew it the way he knew when a tenant farmer's fields were being managed with genuine attention versus managed to appear so from the road. Something in the specific detail, the choice of what to include and what to omit, the way a number was presented without commentary, that trusted the reader to draw the correct conclusion. He had attended the Hartwell Hall evening because he wanted to see who was behind the desk. He had found her immediately before he reached the bottom of the stair. A woman in gray wool at a writing desk positioned where no one had thought to light it properly, working through invoices with the unhurried focus of someone for whom the ballroom's noise was not a distraction but simply weather. He had positioned himself near the east pillar and spent 20 minutes watching her work before she had looked up and found his gaze across the room, and held it for 3 seconds with the steadiness of someone who was not startled and was not impressed and was simply registering information, and then returned to her invoices. He had not, in 14 months, met anyone who had made him feel that the ground was marginally more solid than he had believed it to be. He went home and told Forsyth to arrange an introduction. He also stood on 3 consecutive evenings in the corridor outside his estate's music room because, on the first evening, he had heard, from behind the closed door, someone playing his mother's composition, a short piece she had written herself in the last year of her life, which he had believed no copy of existed outside the family's own collection. He had not opened the door. He had listened for the full 8 minutes of the piece, standing in the unlit corridor with his coat on because he had just come in from the east fields, and when it ended he had remained in the corridor for another quarter hour in case she began again. She did not, but he returned the next evening and the next. He told Forsyth to find out how Miss Marsh had come to know that composition. He did not explain why this mattered. Forsyth, who had been in service to the dukedom for 19 years, did not ask. The introduction, when it came, was arranged by Forsyth under the guise of a business meeting. Miss Marsh arrived at the estate's library on the appointed morning with her account, ledger under one arm and the inspection notes under the other, and she sat across from Forsyth and the Duke and answered every question put to her, with the same quality of attention she brought to the invoices, complete, specific, without ornament. The Duke asked one question that was not about the accounts. He asked where she had learned the Aldermere composition she had been heard playing in the music room. She paused just briefly. "Your mother wrote it," she said. "I found the sheet music in the hall's library, in a folio of miscellaneous scores. It was not attributed. I recognized the style from a published composition of hers I had studied as a girl. I did not know it was private. I apologize if I have trespassed." He looked at her. She looked back with the same 3-second steadiness she had given him across the ballroom. Then she opened the inspection notes to the granary section and said, "There is also the matter of the north granary roof, Your Grace, which I believe requires a decision before January if we are to avoid a spring loss in the stored grain." He had decided before the meeting was over. He told Forsyth so that afternoon. It took another 3 weeks for the formal proposal to be structured, and it was Forsyth who delivered the initial terms, in the language of an arranged agreement rather than anything more personal. The Duke required a capable administrator for the hall, a woman of appropriate standing to serve as its mistress in the social sense, and was prepared to offer a contract of marriage to Miss Marsh, if she was willing to consider it. The contract enclosed with the letter-listed terms that were, Cecily noted, more generous than anything she had been offered in 7 years of invisible work. A household allowance in her own name, a clause giving her authority over estate management decisions below £500 without separate approval, and a provision she had not expected, tucked in the second-to-last paragraph, granting her access to the full archive of the Aldermere estate's historical accounts for any purpose she chose. She read the contract 3 times. She picked up her pencil. She made 4 small annotations in the margins, not objections, but clarifications, points where the language was ambiguous in ways that would create practical difficulty, and sent it back to Forsyth with a brief covering note that said she was prepared to consider the proposal and would welcome the opportunity to discuss the annotated clauses at his convenience. Forsyth had brought the annotated contract to the Duke without comment. The Duke had read the 4 annotations. He had sat for a moment without speaking. Then he had told Forsyth to schedule the discussion and to confirm that all 4 of Miss Marsh's clarifications were accepted. He had not said anything else. He simply accepted them. What no one outside that library meeting knew, what the ballroom's whisper campaign had not yet assembled into its inevitable verdict, was that the arrangement, by the time it began to become visible, had already been decided for 6 weeks. The world would need to catch up. The world caught up in January, and it was not gentle about it. The whisper campaign moved through London's drawing rooms with the efficiency of something that had been given excellent material to work with. The Duke of Aldermere, 31, a significant fortune, a seat in 3 counties, and a manner that had been variously described as austere, difficult, and in one memorable letter reprinted among Cecily's new acquaintances with great relish, excessively self-contained, had apparently fixed his attention on a woman who was none of the things such attention required, not titled, not position, not wealthy. She managed household accounts in gray wool, and she had been seen at the Hartwell Hall evening doing exactly that, at a writing desk behind a pillar, which was where she belonged, wasn't it? And really the whole thing was a bit eccentric, even for Aldermere. Lady Sophronia Vane heard about it on a Thursday. By Friday she had paid a call on her mother, and by Saturday she had accepted an invitation to a dinner at which the Duke was also expected to attend. Wearing the cream-colored gown in its second appearance and a composure as precisely constructed as the Duke's own, Cecily heard about the dinner from Eleanor Forsyth, Edward's daughter, who had introduced herself at the initial library meeting with the directness of someone who had decided they liked a person before the person had done anything to earn it and intended to maintain the position regardless. Eleanor was 27, unmarried by choice, and possessed of the particular indignation of someone who sees clearly and has run out of patience for pretending otherwise. She appeared at the Hartwell Hall desk on a Tuesday morning with a copy of the dinner's guest list. She had it from her father's correspondence, and set it in front of Cecily without preamble. "She will be seated to his left," Eleanor said. "The hostess is a cousin of the Vanes. The whole thing is arranged." Cecily looked at the guest list. She set it aside. "The North Granary roof estimate came in," she said. £73, which is within the margin I projected. I intend to confirm the contractor this afternoon." Eleanor sat down in the chair across from the desk. "You are the most impossible person I have ever liked," she said. "I have managed worse than a dinner party," Cecily said, and she confirmed the contractor. The dinner was, in the event, less significant than Eleanor's concern had suggested. The Duke attended, sat where the seating plan required, and conducted himself with the complete absence of enthusiasm he brought to all social events that had not been his idea. Lady Sophronia was gracious and beautiful, and said 3 clever things that the table appreciated. The Duke acknowledged them. He did not seek her out afterward. He left at 10 o'clock and appeared the following morning at Hartwell Hall to look at the North Granary roof estimate, which Cecily had left on the desk in the east corridor with the contractor's letter clipped to the top and 2 alternative timelines written in the margin in case the first was inconvenient. He stood in the corridor reading the estimate for several minutes. "The alternative timeline," he said without looking up. "Does it account for the weather risk in March?" "Yes," she said. "I consulted the farm manager's records for the last 4 years. March is manageable if we begin by the 20th of February." He nodded. He handed the estimate back. "Confirm the contractor," he said. She already had, but she said, "Yes, Your Grace," and filed it. The institutional opposition was not so easily filed. The Duke of Aldermere's father had been dead for 5 years, but his father's closest friend, a man named Lord Cavendish Price, who had been an investor in 2 of the Aldermere estate's northern properties and who considered himself, by long habit, a voice of appropriate guidance in the dukedom's affairs, was very much alive and very much opposed. He called on the Duke at his London address in mid-January, which the Duke permitted because he had known Lord Cavendish Price for his entire life, and understood that the call was inevitable and that it would be cleaner to conduct it directly than to have it conducted through letters. Cavendish Price was 70 years old and built like a man who had been substantial in youth and had not quite adjusted to having become less so. He sat in the Duke's library with the settled confidence of a man who believed he was performing a service, and he explained, without cruelty but with considerable thoroughness, that the proposed arrangement was structurally inadvisable. The woman was without connections, without title, without the social standing that the management of a ducal estate and the maintenance of a dukedom's position required. The Aldermere name carried obligations that extended beyond the personal preferences of any single holder of the title. The northern investors had concerns. The family's allied interests had concerns. He had concerns. He was not, he wished to make clear, speaking from personal disapproval. Miss Marsh was no doubt a perfectly capable woman in her particular sphere, but from a genuine understanding of what a position of this weight required. The Duke listened to this without expression. When Cavendish Price finished, the Duke said, "The estate's accounts have recovered £400 annually since Miss Marsh's arrival, against a baseline that had been declining for 3 years. The North Granary, which would have represented a spring grain loss of approximately £260 if it had not been identified and repaired, is now scheduled for completion before the February frost. The wool merchant contracts, which were operating on expired terms, have been renegotiated at improved rates. These are the concerns of the northern investors. They are being addressed." Cavendish Price was silent for a moment. "That is not precisely the concern I am raising," he said. "No," the Duke said, "it is not." He stood, which was the signal the meeting had concluded. "I appreciate that you came directly," he said. "I prefer directness." He showed Cavendish Price to the door himself. That evening he arrived at the Hartwell Hall music room at 8 o'clock, knocked, and opened the door without waiting. Cecily was at the pianoforte, going through a technical exercise she had been using to keep her hands in. Practice, nothing of consequence. She stopped when she saw him. He did not sit. He stood near the door with his coat still on from the cold outside, which told her he had come directly without pausing to give it to the footman, and he said, "I want to ask you something that is not about the accounts." She looked at him. "Very well," she said. "My mother's composition," he said. "When you played it in November, was it the first time?" She considered whether the question had a complicated answer. It did not. "No," she said. "I found the score in October. I have played it most evenings since." He was quiet for a moment. She had learned, in their weeks of working acquaintance, that his silences were not absences but calculations. The same machinery she used herself when she needed to establish what a figure actually meant before she spoke about it. "She wrote it in the last year of her life," he said. "I did not know a copy had been left at the hall." "I did not know it was a copy," she said. "I treated it as such when I understood." She paused. "I can restore it to you if you wish." "No," he said almost immediately. Then more measured, "No, play it if it is useful to you." He looked at the pianoforte for a moment. She would have preferred someone use it. He left. She heard his footsteps in the corridor for longer than she should have before they finally ceased. The morning of the formal inquiry began with frost, not the decorative frost of ballroom windows. This was January frost that had settled into the stones of the Aldermere Estate's main receiving room overnight and had not yet released them by 9 o'clock. When the chairs were arranged around the long table and the fire in the grate was doing its imperfect best, the receiving room had been designated for the meeting because Hartwell Hall's library, which would have been Cecily's preference, was too small for the number of people Lord Cavendish Price had apparently decided should be present. There were 11 of them around the table, 3 of the northern investors, one of whom Cecily recognized from the correspondence as Mr. Aldous Bryn, who had written twice to Forsyth expressing discomfort with the proposed arrangement. A family solicitor named Rentham, 2 other titled men whose connection she did not know precisely, but whose posture communicated clearly that they had come to observe rather than to side. Lord Cavendish Price at the table's end, in the chair that naturally collected authority because of its position relative to the door. Eleanor Forsyth, who had invited herself and whom no one had found it practical to exclude, seated 2 chairs down from Cavendish Price with an expression of prearranged patience, Edward Forsyth beside her, the Duke at the table's opposite head, and Cecily at the table's center, with her account ledger, her correspondence file, her inspection notes, and 4 annotated wool merchant contracts set in a neat stack to her left, and the estate's original loan document, the one naming the Duke as primary creditor, the one with the quarterly report provision, open on the surface in front of her. Lady Sophronia was not present. The invitation had apparently not been extended to her, a choice that Cecily had noted without drawing any conclusion from it, because the meeting was not about Lady Sophronia, and it would not serve anyone to make it so. Lord Cavendish Price opened the inquiry by establishing that it was not an inquiry. It was, he said, a conversation of interested parties, a collegial discussion of a proposed arrangement that touched on the interests of many people around this table. No one was on trial. No decisions had been finalized. He looked at the stack of documents in front of Cecily with the particular expression of a man who had not anticipated them. Cecily let him finish. Then she said, "Thank you, my lord. I have prepared a summary of the estate's account since my arrival at Hartwell Hall in August of last year. I will present the figures and then be happy to answer any questions." She opened the ledger. She did not argue. She did not plead. She had understood, when Eleanor had told her about the inquiry 3 days prior, that there was exactly one thing that would matter in this room, and it was not her manner or her birth or the cream-colored gown she was not wearing. It was what she had actually done, expressed in figures that could not be rearranged by opinion or contested by preference. They were records of things that had happened, with dates and amounts and corresponding documents that anyone at this table was welcome to verify. She began with the account state in August. She had the figures from the previous steward's final report, which she had obtained from Hargreaves directly, and she presented the baseline without commentary. Then she presented the current figures. The difference, annualized, was £432 recovered from declining margin, 42 more than the Duke had quoted to Cavendish Price, because she had completed the wool merchant renegotiation in December and the figures had not yet been updated in the conversation he was apparently repeating. She showed the chandler's contract, the original rate, the letter she had written, the new rate, the savings over 11 years at the revised figure. She showed the wool merchant agreements, the expired terms, the renewal clauses, the renegotiated rates, and the letter of confirmation from the Bath merchant, the same Bath merchant she had dealt with on behalf of her family's estate a decade prior, which she did not mention, because the document was sufficient without the history behind it. She showed the North Granary inspection notes with the farm manager's records attached, and the contractor's estimate, and the confirmation of completion she had received the previous week, the work having been done on schedule, within the projected cost. before the February frost. She showed 29 of the 37 outstanding creditor accounts, each with a payment schedule she had established, and the 7 that had already been retired in full. The 8th she explained separately. It was the Aldermere loan itself, and she turned to the loan document already open in front of her and indicated the quarterly report provision and said that she had resumed the reports in September, as the table could verify from the correspondence file she had also brought, and that His Grace's advisor had been in regular receipt of the estate's financial state since that date. She set down the final document. She folded her hands on the ledger. The estate's accounts are in the best condition they have been in since the original steward's departure, she said in the same voice she used to confirm contractor costs. Clear, measured, no performance in it. I am happy to address any question about any figure in these documents. I am also happy to explain my methodology if that is useful. I have nothing else to add. The room did not erupt. There was a long suspended moment in which 11 people processed the weight of what had been placed in front of them, and the thing about documented evidence, about figures on a page with dates attached and corresponding letters clipped and inspection notes in a clear hand, was that it was not a thing that could be interrupted or deflected because it was already complete. Mr. Aldous Bryn spoke first. He asked about the wool merchant renewal terms, specifically the margin improvement percentage. Cecily told him. He wrote it down. He asked a second question about the creditor retirement schedule and whether the pace was sustainable given the estate's income profile. Cecily told him with the 3 figures. He wrote those down as well. His expression by the end of his second question was the expression of a man recalibrating, not warmly, not magically converted, but simply unable to locate the objection he had arrived with, because the evidence had filled the space where the objection would have lived. Lord Cavendish Price did not ask a question. He sat at his end of the table for a considerable time after the others had asked theirs, looking at the documents rather than at Cecily, and something moved across his face that was not warmth but was also not contempt. It was the particular expression of a man who has discovered he was wrong about the nature of something, and does not yet know what to do with that information. When the room had quieted, he said, not to Cecily, not to the table, but to the middle distance in front of him, I had not seen the quarterly reports. It was not an apology. It was not precisely a recalibration, but it was the truth, and it was offered without ornament, and Cecily accepted it as such. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She had known this for 14 years. She was gratified, in a quiet and unhurried way, that the room was beginning to know it as well. She was gathering her documents. The inquiry having adjourned without any formal conclusion, but also without the one it had apparently come to deliver, when the Duke stood from his end of the table. He had not spoken during the inquiry. He had watched her present every document with the same measuring attention he had given her across the ballroom in December, and he had not intervened, and he had not assisted, and she had not needed him to, and she thought. She did not think it as clearly as she might have, because she was focused on whether the wool merchant agreements were filed in the correct order, that perhaps he had known that, he said, to the table, in the tone of a man completing a decision he had made some time ago and was now making visible. I intend to marry Miss Marsh. I wished you to see her work first. The work is the point. It has always been the point. He looked at Cavendish Price. I believe you have the information you came for, my lord. Cavendish Price stood slowly. He looked at Cecily with the brief, assessing look of a man examining something he had undervalued and is now attempting to price correctly. She negotiated the Bath contracts herself, he said. Yes, the Duke said. Cavendish Price was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up his hat from the table and he said, Your father would have liked her, and he left the room. Cecily pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table just for a moment before she straightened and returned to the documents. Eleanor Forsyth appeared at her elbow and said nothing, which was the most considerate thing she could have done, and then linked her arm through Cecily's and walked with her out into the corridor. Lady Sophronia Vane sent a note the following week. It was gracious, which Cecily had not expected, and brief, which she had. It wished the arrangement well and made no claim on anything. Cecily read it once, noted that it required no response in kind but deserved acknowledgement, and wrote a 3-line reply that was equally gracious and equally brief. She returned to the accounts. The Vane matter was, in the way that all structural opposition eventually becomes when the evidence is sufficient, simply irrelevant. The Duke came to the Hartwell Hall Library on a Thursday evening in late January after supper, without Forsyth. It was the first time he had arrived unannounced, and Cecily looked up from the accounts with the quiet alertness she reserved for things that did not match the established pattern. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, which was not the chair of a man conducting business. He set his hat on the table beside him. He did not begin with an account figure or an estate matter. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had learned to read in the weeks of their acquaintance, not unreadable, but requiring more precision than most expressions, because it was assembled from components he kept carefully separated. "I have a second thing to say to you," he said. "The first was said in the receiving room, before witnesses, because you deserved witnesses. This is the part that is true." She set her pencil down. She looked at him with the full attention she gave to things that warranted it. "Not because it is convenient," he said, "or appropriate, or fitted to the requirements my position imposes. Not because you have managed the accounts, though you have, and better than anyone before you. Not because it will satisfy the investors or answer Cavendish Priest's questions. Because you stood in that room this morning and placed every figure on the table without asking for rescue or permission, and you knew the difference between evidence and argument, and you used only the one that mattered. Because you play my mother's music in the evening, and you treat it with the same care you bring to everything. Because you have been keeping rooms standing for 14 years, and you have never once required that anyone thank you for it." He paused. He was not a man who made speeches, and this was as close as he came, and she understood that. "I would like to be the person who sees what you do, for the rest of it, if that is acceptable to you." Cecily was quiet. She thought about it completely, about the 14 years behind her and the shape of what was being offered, about the contract clause granting her authority over decisions below £500, and the archive she had not yet had time to examine, about the music room at dusk and the corridor outside it, about the way he had read her four-annotated clarifications and accepted all of them without negotiation. She thought about her father's voice, the sharpest mind in this house. She thought about what it would mean to finally be in a house large enough. "Yes," she said, "that is acceptable to me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she had not predicted. He reached across the desk and, with a care that suggested he understood the weight of small gestures, he turned her annotated contract, which had been sitting at the corner of the desk for 2 weeks, to face him, and he read the 4 clarifications again, as though committing them to memory. "I accepted all 4, he said. "I know," she said. "I noticed." He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of a man who had forgotten the mechanism existed and had just rediscovered it. Cecily picked up her pencil and set it down again, and thought that his cravat, which was slightly off-center, had been that way since he arrived, and that she had been intending to say so for the last quarter hour, and that she would mention it before he left. She did at the door as he was putting on his hat. "Your cravat," she said. "It has been crooked for 40 minutes. He reached up to correct it, then stopped and looked at her. "Is it troubling you?" "It was noted," she said. He left it as it was, and she thought that this, too, was information. They were married on a Tuesday in March 1815 at the parish church in the village nearest Aldermere Park, in a ceremony with 23 witnesses, which was fewer than the occasion might technically have warranted, and more than either of them had particularly sought. Forsyth was present. Eleanor was present in a hat that expressed her personality in the way that Eleanor's choices generally did, precisely and without apology. Mrs. Sutton, the Aldermere housekeeper, a woman of 50 who had met Cecily on her first visit to the park in February and had shown her the linen inventory without being asked, which Cecily had interpreted correctly as the warmest possible welcome, stood near the back and produced a handkerchief at a point in the proceedings that surprised even herself. The ceremony was unremarkable in its conduct and entirely remarkable in its outcome, and when the register was signed, Cecily had looked at her name, her whole name written in her own clear hand beside his, and had felt something settle into place with the finality of a lock meeting the correct key. Lord Cavendish Price had not attended, but he had sent a case of wine from his estate's cellar, which arrived the day before the ceremony with a card that said only, "For the accounts, correctly managed." She had read it twice and then she had filed it, because it was the sort of document that ought to be kept. The life they built at Aldermere Park was, from the outside, a matter of record. The estate's accounts, which Cecily took over directly from Forsyth's management in the spring of 1815, showed a recovered margin of £900 within the first full year, not because she had made dramatic interventions, but because she had read 11 years of accumulated decisions and identified the 14 places where habit had replaced attention and had replaced habit with method. She hired 2 additional tenant farmers in the second year, negotiated their terms herself, and wrote the agreements in the same clear hand she had used for everything since she was 12. She opened the Aldermere Historical Archive in the autumn of 1815 and spent the better part of the winter reading it. What she found there, 3 decades of estate accounts in 3 different stewards' hands, with the gaps and inconsistencies that accumulate when large properties change hands and lose their institutional memory, she organized into a set of annotated ledger volumes that became in time the basis of a correspondence with 6 neighboring estates whose managers wrote to ask whether she would share her methodology. She shared it. Several adopted it. The annotated methodology was eventually circulated through the solicitors' network in Northamptonshire and the 2 adjacent counties under the name simply of the Aldermere method, because no one in the network had thought to attach her name to it, and she had not corrected this, because she was past the point of requiring the credit and had accepted that the work was the point. Their daughter, Margaret, named for no one in particular, chosen because both of them found it solid and true, was born in December 1816, in the same room where the Duke of Aldermere's mother had spent her last months, which Cecily had opened and aired and filled with light 3 months into her residence at the park, because rooms were for living in. Margaret had her father's precise stillness in observation, and her mother's complete refusal to stop until the thing she was attempting was done, and she could escape her crib at 14 months, in a manner that her mother investigated methodically, and her father watched with an expression Cecily had learned to read by this point as undiluted admiration. The north granary, re-roofed in February 1815, had not leaked since. Cecily checked it herself each October. It was on such an October morning, 5 years into their life at the park, that Cecily was in the library with the previous quarter's accounts spread on the long table. Margaret, now nearly 4, deployed in the corner with a set of wooden blocks that she was applying with engineering seriousness to some project of her own conception, when she became aware that the Duke had arrived in the doorway and had been standing there for some time. This was not uncommon. He watched her work with the same quality of attention she had first noticed across a ballroom, the particular attention of a person for whom the thing they are looking at is simply necessary. She had stopped finding it remarkable and started finding it the texture of daily life, which was, she had decided, the only form love took that she trusted. Not the declaration, but the staying. Not the gesture, but the door open with someone behind it. "The bath merchant has written," she said, without looking up. "He wants to discuss the spring rates." "I know," the Duke said. "His letter came this morning. I left it on your desk." "I saw it," she said. Margaret knocked her tower down with evident satisfaction and looked up at her father. "Fell," she announced. "I observed," said the Duke. He crossed the library and crouched beside his daughter with the same unhurried gravity he brought to everything. And she climbed onto his knee and showed him the pieces. And Cecily watched this for a moment from the corner of her eye. The man who had stood in a corridor for 3 nights listening to music, now sitting on the library floor with a child explaining architectural failure to him. And she thought that her father had been right. The house was large enough. She put down her pencil, picked it back up, and returned to the accounts. The bath merchant's letter was at the corner of the desk. She would answer it after lunch. She had managed the bath merchant for 16 years, across 2 estates and 1 life built precisely where she had chosen to build it. And she was not done yet.